Hello, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to meet with me today to walk you through the presentation for a rate study and cost of service rate study we did for Skamania PD for the electric and water utilities. My name is Sergey Tarasov, and I'm a project manager with FCS Group. Now, today, what you're looking at right now is actually a glossary of terms and hopefully a separate handout that you have available to you. It'll have some terminology that will be used throughout the presentation, some acronyms that are common in the rate setting industry but might not be widely known of. So you can reference hopefully the glossary. There's additional appendices included in this handout which will have tables for bill impacts for different customer classifications, as well as capital improvement program details, which we can reference as we go through the main presentation. So now I will switch to our main presentation. Okay, so now I will walk you through the water and the electric cost of service studies. And as a quick discussion outline, we're going to start out with the overall rate setting process discussion just to get everybody on the same page in terms of what actually goes into a study such as this one. We'll then move into the overall assumptions that went into developing the study for all utilities, and finally get into the results of the water and electric systems, starting with electric utility, followed by the Carson water system, and then the Underwood water system. Once we're done with the ongoing rates, we'll finish the discussion with one-time fees, the system development fees that are imposed on new development as a condition of service for the water utilities. So on this slide, you'll see a visual chart representing the flow or the typical process that goes into developing the ongoing rates through a cost of service type of analysis. It can be split into three separate steps. Step one is typically referred to as a revenue requirement. And the revenue requirement at the very basic level is a comparison of your current rates to your ongoing obligations. And the key here is that we want to make sure that your rates can meet your ongoing expenses on a standalone basis, meaning that the water utility is paying for water expenses, the electric utility is paying for electric expenses. There's no cross-utility subsidy. We're only relying on our rates to fund our obligations. Now, when developing a revenue requirement, it's very important to look beyond direct costs, such as operating costs, power costs in the case of the electric utility, debt service or capital, and really also incorporate fiscal policies, your indirect costs, to make sure you're operating utilities on a sustainable basis. It's also important to look beyond the test year period, kind of the year one of the analysis, and look out in the future, because we know we might have some large costs coming up, not necessarily in year one, but maybe in year 2, 3, or even beyond, that we need to prepare ourselves for and give ourselves opportunity to address in the future. So instead of waiting till year 5 and then having a mountain to climb, you might choose or give yourself an alternative to slowly build up your reserves to fund the project in the future. So looking out in the future just gives you more options. So while step one looks at the overall need, kind of the overall pie, as you might say, step two breaks that pie down into smaller components and really tries to address the question of equity. And do cost differences exist to provide service to various classes of service? In addition to the equity question, the cost of service also can help you establish cost-based unit cost, which can then be utilized to use in the final step of the cost of service analysis study process in the rate design, where we actually develop the fixed and variable charges. In terms of the legal authority, Revised Code of Washington, or RCW 54-24080, grants public utility districts the right to institute rates and charges. And the key here that we wanted to emphasize, the language indicates that the charges have to be fair. Now, in the terms of fairness, that could be slightly ambiguous, because fairness can be in the eye of the beholder. So in the cost of service rate setting industry, we typically like to refer to more towards equity. So the rates and charges shall be equitable, which have standards and industry practices in terms of utility rate setting practices, how to actually perform those analyses, and how to make sure the rates are equitable. Also, we wanted to point your attention to the bottom of the slide, which states that commissioners may, in their discretion, consider the achievement of water conservation goals and discouragement of wasteful water use practices, which indicates that you should be evaluating conservation-based rates for your water utilities and electric utilities if possible. So now let's get into some of the key assumptions, some of the common assumptions that went into establishing the overall analysis for all utilities. Now, in terms of the rate study period, we were looking at 2019 to 24, so 6-year rate setting period for all 3 utilities. Now, in terms of the water utilities, we actually forecasted beyond that. We looked out 20 years to make sure you don't fall off a cliff right after that 6-year period. On the electric system, we were actually looking out 10 years right after that Bonneville Power Administration contract time period through 2028, when that big contractual cost expires and the new unknown cost will be incurred at that time. In terms of revenues, we were using detailed historical statistics to forecast our revenues. We validated those. We wanted to eliminate any seasonalities for any extremes. Like in 2017, we had a pretty hot, cold snap in the wintertime, which generated a lot of revenue. We can't rely on that, so we wanted to use historical data, normalize it, and grow into the future. Now, our growth rates were pretty modest. We were using about a 0.25% growth rate on residential demand and customer account growth on the electric side for residential and general service customers. On the water side, we're using about 1 to 2 connections on the Underwood system per year, and then 4 to 3 connections on the Carson system per year. So pretty low growth assumption, not a low capacity in terms of our system for new development in the next 6-year cycle. On the expense side, we're using the 2019 budget as a foundation, kind of as a baseline for our analysis. We went through it in quite a bit of detail with internal staff. We made sure we eliminated any or adjusted for any one-time expenses to avoid escalating those into the future, and then applied various escalation factors for general cost inflation, labor cost inflation, and benefits to forecast those expenses into the future. On the capital side, if we're assuming the need for any revenue bonds, which we'll get into in a couple of slides, or any new debt issuances, we're currently assuming revenue bond financing. We're not relying on low interest loans. Those are pretty scarce at this time. So to be conservative, we're assuming any need for debt proceeds will be met with the revenue bonds. On the electric utility side, the power costs are being escalated into the future with about a 5% biannual increase. So that's an increase every other year, starting in fiscal year 2020. Fiscal year from a federal perspective starts in October, and the next one will be fiscal year 2020, which will start this year, October 2019. Historically, Bonneville has had increases ranging from anywhere from 5 to 9% in the last 3 to 4 biannual increases. So it's hard to say what they're going to be instituting. So that at the time of the completion of the study, we were assuming a 5% overall average increase for both power and transmission costs, and then a 5% biannual increase every year thereafter. If you annualize that 5% without compounding, that's less than 2.5% per year adjustment. Finally, as I mentioned, those indirect costs, we have fiscal policies. We have included 4 policies in all utilities, starting with the operating reserve. The operating reserves are there to help you maintain the volatility between how revenues are coming in, how expenses are coming out. You might have revenues coming in on a high end during the wintertime for the electric utility or the summertime for the water utilities. And then in the shoulder months, such as the springtime and the fall time, you might not be receiving as much revenue, while you might be having one-time large expenses such as debt service coming out at a different time. So to make sure we have enough money to account for that timing differential, or if we have a seasonal differential, let's say we have a mild winter for the electric utility or a mild summer, we want to make sure that we avoid going to the rate increases if we can and weather out those odd years through our operating reserves. So on that end, we're assuming a 35% of annual O&M reserve for all utilities, and then the electric utility also has a 20% of annual power expense included on top of that. For capital reserve, we're assuming 1% of plant and service for the electric utility and 2% for the water utility. Now, this reserve is meant to be more of a savings account. It's not an annual item that you're funding once you have met that reserve. It's more of it's meant to help with emergencies, projects that are unplanned. If you have, as an example, a block of main that goes out and you need to start repairing it, we need to make sure we have enough of a savings to start the process and give us enough time to secure the full resources necessary. The next fiscal policy we're including into our analysis is called system reinvestment funding. Now, it can also be called depreciation funding, but in general, the concept is our system is older, it's deteriorating as a lot of systems throughout the country or throughout the state. Our existing customers are wearing out the system, and they need to be replacing it through rates, through ongoing cash financing. Now, in the perfect world, we would have an asset management study, and we would be focusing on a replacement cost basis type program. But in reality, those programs are very expensive, and replacement cost is substantially more expensive than original cost. So to do a compromise, a lot of utilities in the industry, an industry practice is to look at funding 100% of annual depreciation. Again, recognizing that annual depreciation is based off of original cost, and replacement costs will be substantially higher. So we will still be relying on debt as we go along when we are financing our costs and replacing on our system. And the final fiscal policy that we have included into the study is regarding revenue bond covenants. This is actually a legal requirement. The bare minimum legal requirement for revenue bonds for Skamania PD is 1.25 coverage ratio. And the ratio is basically an assurance for the bond holders that we will make our payment. It's basically a comparison of your revenues less expenses divided by the revenue bond payment. So that payment needs to be, the net revenue needs to be 1.25 times larger than the revenue bond payment itself. That's the bare minimum requirement. If we are looking to go out to the market into the future, we want to make sure we're rated as best as we can to reduce our costs of interest into the future. So we want to target actually a higher coverage ratio than that. So ideally, we're trying to hit a coverage target of about 1.75 if we can. Now, when we were developing the analysis, there's a lot of alternatives we looked at in terms of how do we fund our operating costs, how do we fund our capital costs, and we condensed those into 3 alternatives, which we reviewed with the PUD, with the board back in November 2018. The first scenario we looked at was heavily weighted debt scenario, trying to minimize the front-end increases. Now, what that scenario resulted in is your future costs are actually becoming larger and larger by carrying a lot of interest that you have to support over time. So that scenario was lower on the front end, but it was becoming more expensive on the back end. The flip side of that, we try to look at achieving system reinvestment, that cash funded capital equal to depreciation right away. That was scenario 3. That reduced the amount of debt that we needed, but it greatly increased the front end increases. So we try to go somewhere in the middle while we're still achieving fiscal policies, especially the one related to system reinvestment. We're trying to do that over a 5-year period. So we're phasing in our system reinvestment funding over a 5-year period. This results in the moderate approach. We're not relying on debt as heavily, but we're still utilizing it and trying to balance our increases and achieving fiscal policies over that time horizon. So all the discussion will be centered around scenario 2. We'll start our discussion, the details, with the electric utility. So on this slide, you'll find a summary of the key components, kind of that step 1. We're still focusing now on the revenue requirement. On the upper left corner of the slide, you'll see the table summarizing the key components, starting with the existing rate revenues. Our current revenues before any increases, because as I mentioned before, the first step that we want to do is look at, can our current rates or current levels meet our obligations before we even look at alternative funding sources or potential increases. So currently our rates, our current levels are generating about $11 million. As I mentioned, the growth rates are fairly low, so not a lot of growth in that 6-year period. Our operating and maintenance expenses are about $5.5 to $6.5 million. Our power costs are also at that level, about $5.5 to $6 million. We currently have approximately $600,000 in debt on hand right now. That's an annual payment of $600,000 per year. And we are forecasting the need of approximately another $100,000 to $400,000 of new debt service. And that's necessary to fund new debt associated with $17.8 million of capital that's forecasted in the next 6-year period. Again, that includes inflation assumptions for the capital. Now, if you look down below, we're assuming 2 new revenue bond issues, $1.1 million in 2020 and $4 million in 2022. Again, we're trying to utilize our fund balances first, rate funded capital system investment, any proceeds that we have, tax proceeds, before we're assuming new debt issues. But it looks like in order to fund that $17.8 million, we do need to issue two bond issues. Again, that's approximately 30% of our capital program, or slightly less, that we're doing through debt, but we are issuing some new proceeds. And finally, our system reinvestment, we are phasing up to 100% over a 5-year period. So we're going from about $100,000 that we can embed in our rates up to about 1.8 million, which is projected depreciation by the end of the projection period. Looking at the upper right corner of the presentation, the graphic shows the annual capital expenditures by year. And here you'll see that our capital expenditures are fairly consistent, about $1.3 to $2 million per year, fairly constant, with the exception in 2023. In that year, we do have a pretty large project. The North Bonneville substation rebuild is included in that project, which is also why we're assuming the issue of $4.0 million in that year. So putting everything together results in the summary of the revenue requirement. Here you can see a visual representation of that summary. The bars here represent expenses. They're made up of the dark brown color at the bottom, showing you the cash operating expenses portion, followed by the total power costs in the orange. Again, this piece of the expenses, the district has no control over since they're incurred or passed through from Bonneville. The next portion of the bar is in yellow, and that's existing debt service, followed by a small sliver of kind of a purple color, which is new debt service, and then the remainder is rate-funded capital being phased up and some amounts of reserve rebuilding and funding those fiscal policies. So right away, if we look at 2019, comparing our bars to our solid black line representing revenues at current levels, our revenues are not sufficient to even meet our existing debt in full capacity. So how do we solve the deficiency? Based on scenario 2, we're proposing annual increases of 7% per year for the next 4 years, followed by 4 3/4 and 4% in 2024. Again, these are preliminary projections. The front end is more certain as we got in the future. The PUD will definitely be revisiting the assumptions internally, and before we get even to 2022, we'll make sure that everything is in order, and if there's any modifications, the plan could change. But right now, the preliminary findings that are recommended are 7% per year. Now, what does that mean for a typical type customer? A residential home that's using 1,100 kilowatt hours on a monthly basis, they currently are paying $106.24 per month. That would be increasing by $7.44 up to $113.68 per month with simply an across-the-board adjustment. Now, we'll get into rate design in a couple of slides, but this is just to give you an idea what kind of a magnitude of an impact that could have for a typical residential home. Now we're going to shift gears and focus on cost of service. So this is a transition to step 2. Similar to the overall age study process, the cost of service has a multi-step process as well. The first step breaks your costs down of the revenue requirement. So this is where we take the pie, which is revenue requirement, and now we start to breaking it down into pieces. So the first step breaks those costs down into functions of service, which for the electric utility is power or power production generation or purchases in your case, distribution, the actual distribution of energy to the customers, transmission, getting the energy from the source to the utility, and then customer type costs. Within each function of service, those costs are classified by the type of the cost they are, and the industry that's typically summarized into energy type cost, demand cost, and customer cost. So starting with the pie chart, this is a summary of the classification process for the PUD's electric system. The energy costs represented in green are about 43% of your total costs, and they're mostly made up of purchases from Bonneville. Now, these type of costs vary by customer with the actual amount of usage of electricity, and they're typically assessed on a kilowatt hour basis. The next portion of the chart is in orange. It's representing demand. It's about 24% of your total cost. Now, these costs are associated with upsizing your infrastructure to meet peak demand. And just to give you an idea what that's related to, a good example I like to use is a holiday. Let's say you have a large family that gets together for Christmas once a month. Everybody comes home. Everybody turns on all the electricity, every single light bulb. There's TVs, all cooking, heating's on. Then the next day, everybody goes home, and that system, while that system is not being utilized, it's still there and it's ready. So basically, demand peaking upsizing is represented for what is a maximum event that can occur, and we need to make sure that we can provide you that power at any time if you need it, even though you might not be using it at all times. So it's a maximum event during a given period of time, and usually it's associated with a billing period. So within a month, what is the maximum rate of use that we can have per customer? Now, typically, if you do have a customer charge or a demand charge, it will be represented through a kilowatt type of basis. But what's important to note is that even though you might not see a demand charge on your bill when you receive a bill, it doesn't mean there's no demand costs that are there. It just means that it might be embedded in the energy charge or the customer charge due to complexity and simplicity of the charges, explaining what they are, as well as the capability of actually reading demand. A lot of residential meters are not able to read demand itself. Finally, the last component of our costs is the customer cost component. It's in general, it's about 33% of your total cost of your revenue requirement. And in general, you can think of these type of costs are those type of costs that don't change with the usage of electricity. So unlike power, sending out a bill or reading a meter doesn't really matter how much electricity you use. Now, what's important to remember is that in addition to the simple costs or direct costs such as metering, billing, accounting, kind of those are pretty easy examples to understand. It's important to note that the backbone of the system should also be recovered through the customer charge. We have poles that are in the ground, transformers, conductors, wires in the ground. It doesn't matter how big of an upsizing of customer we might have, we still need to put in a pole. Now we can allocate a portion of that price for upsizing, but also a portion of that cost should be there and maintained at all times. Doesn't matter if it's used or not, it needs to be still functioning. So putting everything together, going through your detailed customer statistics, developing allocation factors, developing customer profiles, and spreading those customer cost pools that you saw classifications on the previous slide to actual customers results in the cost of service analysis. And what the cost of service analysis indicates to us is that cost differences and equity differences do exist. The results did show that the residential class and general service non-demand metered, so just a caveat here, non-metered means they don't have a demand meter, because some other customers, some general service customers do have a demand meter. So residential and general service non-demand metered customers need to increase slightly above the average increase. So we saw on the first step that the average increase is 7%. The results indicate that they need to be above that 7%. The general service demand metered customers and large industrial customers need to be increased below the average increase. And the cannabis customer, there's actually a customer category for cannabis type loads. They're currently are tied to BPA load growth rates. Those are rates secured for tier 2 type power. They're currently more expensive than tier 1 power, and this customer is served directly from that rate. So we are still tying that customer to that classification of service, and we're only focusing on the customers that are being allocated the tier 1 power. So what the cost of service indicates is that cost differences do exist because our RCW does indicate we need to be as equitable as possible. We're recommending to go towards cost of service, but to avoid significant upfront impacts, we're proposing to do it over a multi-year period. So here in the table down below, you'll see a 6-year phase-in for the cost of service. So on average, once you weigh all the classes together, we get our 7% for the first 4 years. But if you dive in deeper by class of service, our residential customers, if you'll note, are slightly above at about 9%, 8.9%, and so on by year. For our residential customers, our general service non-demand metered are around 11.6% per year, while our general service demand metered customers and our large industrial customers are below that 7. So again, everybody weighted together will still generate 7% in revenue, but to get us to cost of service, which we're achieving about 5 or 6 years, we're having different impacts by class of service. So now we move into the final step of the electric utilities rate study process. That's that rate design process. Now, the number one objective of rate design is to make sure that the rates we develop are generating the appropriate revenue levels we've identified in the first 2 steps. We also want to make sure that they're cost-based and equitable, and they're meeting the goals and objectives identified by policy by the utility. So in this proposal, what we're going to be focusing on is, number 1, aligning the cost with the cost of service phase-in, which was shown by class of service as a percentage by year. So that's our first objective. The second objective, we also want to align our unit costs that we'll be talking about in a second with cost of service. So we'll be focusing on aligning our basic or fixed customer monthly charges with cost of service over that 6-year time period. So what you're looking at in the chart up above is the cost-based unit cost description for all classes of service, not including the lighting classes, for the bookend periods for 2019 at the top portion of the chart, and then the 2024 time period for the bottom. You'll notice that they're broken down by energy, and you'll see that energy, basically the energy electricity cost needs from the Bonneville that we're purchasing, is about 4.14 cents per kilowatt hour, and it's equal for all customer classes. Demand varies based on the efficiency of the customer class. And again, remember, as I mentioned, just because we don't assess the demand charge for our customers doesn't mean there's no demand cost. It just means we're recovering those costs through either the energy charge, customer charge, or the combination of the two. Now you'll notice also that there's a customer charge, and the cost-based unit cost for residential customers is about $51.46. Fast forward to 2024 projections, the updated customer charge is $73.59. Now, we're not recommending to go to those cost of service levels in year one, but as you'll see on the next slide, which I'll be going to right now, we're trying to move and phase in our rates towards that level over that 6-year time period. So instead of going to $51 in 2019, we're going to $30 for residential customers, and then so on and so forth until we get to cost of service over a 6-year period. So here, we're focusing on aligning our fixed charges with cost of service, and our energy and demand charges make up the difference to get to those class-based percentages that we have discussed now 2 slides ago to get us to cost of service. Okay, so the next slide will focus on the actual impacts for the residential class. Now, we're only going to show you the impacts for the residential class in this presentation, but you can reference to that glossary of terms and alternative appendices that I mentioned in the beginning of the discussion. They will have the impacts for other classifications of services. So on this slide, what you're looking at are 3 tables. The first table looks at the overall average impacts by various usage levels, and we have highlighted in the gray in the middle what the average customer is for the electric utility. This is the annual average, and on average, an average residential home is using about 1,100 kilowatt hours on a monthly basis. If you're using less than that, or in a month you're using less than that, you can reference various usage levels below that number, or if you're above that number, you can reference those numbers above as well. The table in the middle shows you the average impact by those usage levels by month, and then the third table shows you the percentage increase. So you'll notice here that, as I mentioned before, a typical customer using 1,100 kilowatt hours on a monthly basis is currently paying $106.24 with the cost of service phase-in. So again, this is a little bit different than the prior example, which was just across the board. Here, with the cost of service residential phase-in, the first year would be adjusted by $9.78 up to $116.02, which is approximately 9.21% increase for that usage level. And that'll vary depending on how much you're using per month and depending on the year. Finally, for the electric utility, we have a neighboring utility comparison. I always want to caution to look at this chart with it's an apples and oranges. Just exercise some caution. Here we're showing what a typical bill is for the PUD, and then with the same level of usage, what that bill would be in the neighboring utilities. Right now, the PUD on this sample is on the upper end of the middle comparison, and the position will not change. The reason why I want to caution is that each system is different. Some systems are more dense and very large. Some systems are more rural and very spread out. It's more expensive to operate those. Also note that we're comparing the PUD's rates today and tomorrow, proposed rate, versus everybody else's rates today. And most likely, a lot of utilities are undergoing a similar study process and will be modifying their rates as well in the near future. So again, exercise caution when looking at these charts. With that, we'll move on to the water utilities, and here we'll start with the Carson system. So the slides will be very familiar to the electric system that we just covered. We'll start again with step 1. Here are the key components. Looking at the upper left table again, notice we have rate revenues and current rates. And one item to point out is that we have approximately $770,000 on the Carson system. Compare that to the electric utility, which was $11 million, tells us that this system is substantially smaller than the electric system that the PUD provides service to. On the O&M side, we have approximately $561,000 to $612,000 in that 6-year forecast. We have $200,000 or so in existing debt service, and we are forecasting the need for new debt service of about $51,000 annually, increasing to $126,000 annually thereafter. And that debt service is associated with 2 issues: one in 2020 of about $575,000, and one in 2022 of about $850,000. Now, just an item to note is that this is just the share of the debt proceeds that will be going to the Carson system. We are assuming that that issues will be a combined debt issue, combined with the electric system, with the Underwood system, so it'll be one large bond issuance, and this is just represents the share of costs associated to the Carson system. We are also including system reinvestment funding. We're starting at $30,000. We are trying to get to 100% depreciation funding of about $214,000 by 2024. So that's full depreciation level. Finally, that new debt service, as I mentioned before, is funding almost $3 million of capital. As you can see on the chart to the right, it's the average years are about $300,000 to $400,000. We do have a couple of peak years with a couple of projects. Major road transmission lines included, and some AMI metering replacement costs are included in those 2 peak years that we're assuming will require debt issuances. But what's important to note is that we're talking today about the 6-year period, but specifically for this utility, because we did look out 20 years, we wanted to make sure you didn't fall off a cliff. There is a pretty substantial capital need on this system. So if you look at the bottom of the slide, beyond 2024, we're forecasting another $28.4 million in capital inflated to the year of construction for 2025 to 2038, with about almost half of it, $12.6 million, occurring towards the end of that period, around 2038 or so. And that will include projects including the Wind River Intake Transmission Line. It will include the water treatment plant expansion projects, as well as a new reservoir project around that time period. So there's quite a bit of need, but we are forecasting a future. So we're making sure that the utility does not fall off a cliff and would require a substantially large increase thereafter. So we're taking that into account in our proposal and our projection. So putting everything together on this slide, you have the summary of the revenue requirement. Here again, the bars represent expenses. The dark brown is cash operating expenses, followed by existing debt service in kind of the gold yellow color, followed by the violet purple for new debt, and then rate funded system investment in the green and the darker color representing additional reserve funding and capital funding. Similar picture here, the solid black line representing revenues of current rates is not sufficient to meet our needs currently. And in order to keep our system reliable to build our capital and provide our customer service, we need to adjust our rates. Our proposal is approximately 8.25% annual increase. What does that mean to a typical residential home? Using 700 cubic feet or 7 CCF on a monthly basis with a 3/4 inch meter. Currently, they're paying $52.99. That'll increase their average rate of $4.37 up to $57.36. Now, again, this is strictly focusing on an across-the-board average increase. When we get into rate design, depending what the cost of service indicates, that could change by cost of service. But this is just to give you an idea of a magnitude of an average increase of an 8.25% increase. Moving on to step 2, the cost of service. Again, that equity evaluation is for the water utility. Now, the functions of service and the classification of service are different in terminology, but they serve the same type of function. So here we're looking at base type costs. Base costs are there related to developing a system to provide average condition service. So what kind of pipes do we need to provide regular water? How much storage do we need to provide regular conditions without upsizing for anything else? Peak type costs are there related to upsizing our infrastructure, including pipes, pumps, storage reservoirs, all those facilities to meet peak demands. And both of those are the largest portion of your costs, with base representing 36% of your revenue requirement, and the peak type costs are represented through about 43% of your total costs. Next, we have fire-related costs. An important item to note here is that these costs are associated with not only fire hydrants, but also the upsizing of infrastructure, again, for pipes, to have enough fire pressure to fight a fire event, to have a substantial storage requirement to meet a fire event, as well as pumps to be able to pump the additional water at the pressure required to put out a fire event. Followed by customer costs at 10% and meter and services at 3%. Those are costs related with providing billing, as we talked about on the electric side, as well as the meters themselves, the maintenance, replacement of them by size, which varies a little bit as well. So developing the cost of service, here it's a little bit simpler. We have 2 classifications of service, unlike on the electric system. We have the residential customers and the commercial customers. And what the cost of service indicates here is that the residential customers need to go up slightly below the average, and the commercial customers need to go above the average. So instead of doing a one-time cost of service adjustment, similar to the electric system, we're proposing a multi-year phase-in. So here you'll notice that the residential customers are going up slightly below the 8.25, and the commercial customers are going above the 8.25 to avoid those front-end shock increases and getting two costs of service over a 5-year period. As I mentioned on the electric system, the PED staff will be reviewing our assumptions throughout the year to make sure everything's consistent, and we'll be revisiting these results before the 6-year time period is up to make sure the results are consistent. Moving on to rate design, as I mentioned on the electric side, the number one objective is to make sure the rates we develop collects appropriate revenues, but we also want to make sure they're cost-based, equitable, and meeting the goals and policy objectives of the utility. So when reviewing the existing rates for the water utility, we currently have two components to the rate. We have a fixed charge, and if you're looking at under the existing rate column, you'll see that it's about $43.75 for residential customers, and then it varies by meter size for commercial customers. Now, the first item we noted is that starting at 2-inch meters, the fixed charges are the same. So even though the meter sizes are getting larger, the meters themselves cost more, and the meters have more capacity available to them. Currently, the rate itself is the same. So our first proposal is to modify the rate and continue increasing those rates at the meter size differential going above 2-inch meters. So you'll see that instead of keeping them the same, they are increasing with meter size. The second component of the rate is currently a volume rate with a 4-tier structure. Under this structure, once you exceed a certain usage threshold, your next usage, incremental usage, is charged at a higher rate. So first 400 cubic feet or 4 CCF are included in the fixed fee currently. The next 16 or so are charged at $3.08. Following that, the next 30 are charged at $3.39, and anything above that is charged at $3.69. Now, following the RCW's recommendation of evaluation of a conservation-based fee to discourage discretionary type usage, we wanted to enhance the conservation message a little bit. We also noticed that your commercial customers and your residential customers are on the same tiered structure. Now, typically in the industry, this is not a very common approach to assess a tier structure that's the same for commercial customers, because really the purpose of the tier structure is to discourage and disincentivize the discretionary type usage. Now, on the commercial side, we might have a very inefficient small customer and a very efficient large customer. But by nature of being large, the large customer will always be in the upper tier, being penalized for being large, but not necessarily inefficient. Therefore, we're proposing to modify the commercial structure and put them into a separate uniform rate that's the same for all usage levels. Just increase, the more you use, the more you pay concept. And really, the focus with larger commercial customers is typically more effective through education. So reaching out to the commercial customers, providing them with ways to eliminate discretionary type usage typically works better than through a tier type structure. So what you'll notice here, going back to the residential tier rate, to enhance the conservation message, we wanted to eliminate the allowance, kind of the inclusion of that first 400 cubic feet or 4 CCF within the fixed charge. So now we're charging for all usage starting in 2019, but to recognize sort of the fact that we want to keep our rates for lifeline usage levels for cooking, for bathing purposes, kind of winter time usage as affordable as possible, we're keeping that rate fairly low at $1. And even our second tier rate is at $2.25, which is below the current second tier rate. Once we get into those second tiers and third tiers, now this is where we're starting to focus on conservation impact and starting to recover those costs a little bit associated with discretionary usage in those blocks. Now, you'll notice that the major changes are only occurring in 2019. After that, in 2020 and thereafter, everything is just increased across the board proportionally with a class-specific increase just to get us to the overall average class-based target. So now let's take a look at some of the impacts from these changes. Again, we're going to focus on the residential bill impact. For this presentation, you can reference the glossary material and the appendix material for the commercial impacts. Here we're looking for a typical residential home using 7 CCF on an average monthly basis. Currently is paying $52.99. it'll be increasing to $57.52, which is a $4.53 increase for an average customer in year one. Now, in the first year in 2019, there's going to be a different impacts by usage level. Once we stabilize and make those changes, every year thereafter, the increases will be proportionate based on the overall increase, as you can see in the table below through the dollars and the percentages to the right. So that concludes the Carson system. Now we'll move on to the water utility, the Underwood system. And this is going to be very similar to the prior two utilities. Again, starting with key components. One item to note again is that the Underwood system is quite a bit smaller than even the Carson system. So this is the smallest system of the three utilities being served by the PUD. Here, our existing revenues are about $400,000, $407,000 to $410,000 per year. Our expenses are $318,000 to $346,000. We have current debt service of about $115,000 to $121,000 per year, but we are assuming additional debt to fund our capital. We currently are projecting $3.2 million in capital in that 6-year time period, and that is being spread out over 4 debt issues. Again, the combined debt issues will be the same for all utilities, but this is just the Underwood's share of that debt. So the first debt issue being projected is in 2020 at $425,000, followed by 2022 at $625,000, and then $1.5 million in 2024. And that's actually, that's 3 debt issues. So we are funding majority of our costs, close to 75% of our capital costs through new debt. Now you'll notice that the capital program itself is actually slightly larger in that 6 years in the Carson system, while the Underwood system is actually a smaller system. So there's a lot of maintenance that we need to accomplish for this utility. On average, if you look at the chart to the right, our projects are fairly equal, $300,000 to $400,000 per year average. We do have a couple of peak years, especially in 2024. It does include a Scogans Road transmission project of about $1 million or so, which is represented in that year. Putting everything together, we get our chart again. The bars represent expenses made up of operating expenses in the brown, the gold or yellow representing existing debt service, followed by the new violet purple color for new debt service, and then rate fund and capital and reserve funding and additional capital funding in the darker green colors at the top. Now you'll notice that in addition to the solid black line, we do have 2 additional lines represented here as well. The first line is representing the light blue, kind of dash color, the longer dashes. That represents our ending projected balance for capital purposes. And the dashed green line represents our target for capital. Now, if you look at 2019, we pretty much have no funds available in 2019 for construction, which indicates we don't have any time to phase in our capital plan. And therefore, it really limits what we can do in terms of smoothing out rate impacts. So because of that, because we are not even covering our existing debt for this utility, we are showing a one-time higher front-end increase of about 22.5% for the system needed in 2019, which will be followed by 13% thereafter for the next 5-year period. So what does that mean for an average customer? A residential home with a 3/4-inch meter, currently that customer is paying $85.72. That would be increasing by $19.29 to $105.01 in the first year. Moving on to cost of service, the functions of service and classifications of service are identical to the Carson system. The results are slightly different. Base and peak costs make up about 40% each, followed by customer at 10%, fire at 6%, and meters and services at 3%, around it or so. Now, the system currently has rates for only one class of service. It's the same for all customers, but after reviewing the detailed information, after discussion with staff, it appears that there's also, in addition to residential customers, there's also orchard and vineyard irrigation type customers on the system. Well, so what we did for this study is we actually evaluated those customers through statistics. We pulled them out as its own class of service and wanted to see if they're covering their equitable share of costs. And what the cost of service indicated is that they're actually paying below their cost of service, and they need to go up higher than the overall average, while the residential class can go up lower than the overall average. So the cost of service did find cost-based increases that needed to be incorporated. So similar to other two utilities, the Carson system and the electric system, we are proposing a phased-in approach to avoid kind of the front-end impact to our customers over that 5-6 year time period. Looking at the rates for the Underwood system, everybody's currently assessed the same fee of $59 by meter size, while we did find that there are some customers with larger meters. So similar to the discussion on the Carson system, if anybody has a bigger meter size, those meters are more expensive, they provide more capacity, there's more maintenance costs associated with them. So we're proposing to bill them with a similar differential as in the Carson system for larger meters. So if you have a larger meter, you're going to be paying a larger fixed charge. So you can see here in 2019, we're transitioning to a larger fixed charge. Now on the volume side, we currently have a 4-tier structure as well. The blocks are a little bit different for this utility compared to the Carson system, but there's still 4 tiers. The first 2 units, or 2 CCF, or 200 cubic feet of water, are currently included with the fixed charges, followed by $3.34 for the next 8 CCF, then $3.82 for the next 50, and then $4.77 for anything above that. Our proposal is to again enhance conservation while still focusing on the lifeline rates. So we are charging for all usage now, starting in 2019, but we are trying to keep it at the lower level of $1.40 for the first 2 CCF, and then the second block is still cheaper than the second tier currently, so at $2.80. Then we're trying to recover and send that conservation pricing signal through our 3rd tier and through 4th tier. Now for vineyards and orchards, we're separating their rate. We are keeping their first 2 tiers tied to the residential rates. Again, this covers our average consumption for our lifeline usage through our average yearly usage. And then deviating from those 2 tiers in tier 3 and tier 4, this is where we're actually recovering the differential to get to cost of service. So for that actually discretionary consumption amounts for irrigation purposes, those drivers are causing us to upsize our facilities. That's where we're recovering the costs and getting to cost of services in tier 3 and 4. So now there's going to be 2 tier structures, one for residential customers and one for orchards as well. On this slide, you'll find the bill impacts comparison for residential customers, assuming a 3/4 inch meter. They're currently paying, as we talked about, $85.72 for 10 CCF on a monthly basis. That will be going up to $96.11 or $10.39 increase the first year. Now, the big changes will be occurring in the first year. As you'll see, after that, the increases will be assessed on an across-the-board basis, so that it will be proportioned for all usages. But in the first year, when we do that transition, the impacts will vary depending on the usage amount by customer. We are also including the orchard and vineyard comparison here as well. Their average usage is substantially larger, almost 3.5 times larger than the average. Again, this is the average. During peak times, we're using even more than that. So the usage is 35 CCF on the monthly basis, which currently is costing about $181.22 per month. That will be going up to about $247.80 per month, or $66.50 increase for these customers. Now, one item to note is that this is for a 3/4 inch meter. Since we are assessing fees now by meter size, if a customer has a bigger meter size, the impacts will be slightly different. So now that concludes the presentation, and here we have the sampling monthly bills. Again, I want to emphasize caution comparing these to other utilities, since we don't really know their requirements, their magnitudes, what they're doing, if they're deferring their maintenance to keep their rates lower. So just again, simply informational type of data. Here we see the Carson system is in the lighter green, the Underwood system is in the upper darker green, and you can see here where our systems are on the upper end of the comparison, not really changing their timing except for the Carson proposed rate. But again, we're not really sure what these other utilities are going to be instituting in the upcoming year as well. So that concludes our overall ongoing rate discussion. Now we're going to shift gears to system development fees, which are more related to one-time fees. So what are they? They're really one-time fees imposed on new development or certain upsizing redevelopment as a condition of service. And I really like to think of them as an equity type fee. You can think of them as new customers reimbursing existing customers for the capacity upsizing that they put in into the system. Since the customer connects to the system, there's already a treatment plant, let's say, in place for the water utility. That treatment plant can provide more capacity than existing customers need, and therefore future customers are reimbursing the existing customers for that investment. You can also include future assets necessary to add growth to the system. Now, in terms of legal authority, Revised Code of Washington 5424/080 grants the PUDs the authority to impose these fees, but it doesn't provide a lot of guidance in terms of how to actually develop them. So we use industry standard practices as well as legal authority for other utilities such as special districts or cities to develop an approach that's legally applicable to PUDs. Now, again, since these costs have to be based on the cost of the infrastructure of the system, and they have to represent a proportionate share of capital, the revenues generated from these fees can only be used to pay for capital purposes. It cannot be used to pay for ongoing maintenance, O&M type of costs. So performing the calculation results in the following two charts: the Carson systems on the left and the Underwood systems on the right. So currently, the calculated maximum allowable charge here for the Carson system is $7,691, which is a $191 increase from the current fee. So not a significant increase here. On the Underwood system, currently the charge is $10,000. Based on the calculation, it can be increased up to $26,261, and it could fluctuate by meter size. So here, the difference is $16,261. Now, what's important to remember is that this is a maximum allowable charge, meaning we can set our charge up to that level, not above that level. If you do, by policy, decide to set these fees below that maximum allowable level, you just need to recognize the fact that that money has to come from somewhere else, which will most likely be rates. Now, after discussions with the board, we're proposing to phase in the Underwood rate over a 3-year period. So we're proposing equal increments or so, about $5,000 in 2019, so a $15,000 charge for a 3/4 inch meter in 2019, $20,000 in 2020, and $26,000 in 2021. To give you an idea how the actual charge was calculated, as I mentioned before, the charges are made up of two components: one reimbursing the existing customers for their existing infrastructure in the system. So currently, that's about 6.9 that's allocable on the existing cost basis for the Carson system. The Carson system can provide capacity for existing customers and future customers, which is approximately 2,900 equivalent units. We're using meter capacity equivalents, which are based on safe operating flows for your meter sizes. So taking the allocable cost basis divided by allocable capacity equivalent units results in that portion of the fee charge of about $2,163. The second portion of the charge is the future cost basis. Here we have the projects that are necessary to add growth. So we start with that 20-year CIP provided for the Carson system. We look at the projects, and we only include the capacity enhancing share of the projects. Some are there fully capacity enhancing, some are providing a portion capacity as well. So as an example, the Brooks Reservoir is considered about 77% capacity enhancing. So we're only including 77% of that cost. The storage function of service will add about 836 new equivalent units. So taking that $77,000 that's allocable to growth, dividing it by 836 new capacity equivalents results in $92 associated to the Brooks Reservoir that can be added to the fee. We perform the same exercise for all projects. We roll them up, and the future capacity portion of the fee is about $5,500. We add the two components together, the $2,163 and the $5,528, which results in $7,691 per equivalent unit, or for a 3/4 inch meter, which increases by meter size as we saw in the previous slide. The same exercise can be performed for the Underwood system. We have our existing cost basis and eligible equivalent units. That portion of the fee is about $7,300. Going through all the projects results in a fee of about $18,000, combining to that $26,000 that we talked about now 2 slides ago. So with that, we have our final comparative slide. This slide, again, is even more apples and oranges because these fees are supposed to be based on truly the cost of the system, unless by policy they're set at a lower amount. So each system is designed differently. Each system has different challenges, such as topographical challenges. Getting water up a hill will be more expensive if somebody doesn't have any hills and it's flat and utilizing gravity. So again, very apples and oranges comparison, but your current fees for the Carson system are on the lower end. Your Underwood system is on the middle end of the comparison, but will be increasing up to the upper end portion. Again, tying to the cost of the providing service to your customers. With that, we get to the next steps. The fees have been approved and presented to the board. Here, they've been approved on February 19th, and they will be taking effect on March 1st. Future increases will be effective in January. So again, this increase, due to the delay in the implementation, will be going into effect in March. Future adjustments will be going in January. And again, as always, as I mentioned several times already, staff will be monitoring the assumptions that were incorporated in the study fairly closely. If anything deviates either way, they will revisit the study and make the appropriate adjustments necessary. With that, we get to our questions and discussions.